It is a distinct pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce Dr. José Aldemar Álvarez Valencia this evening. Dr. Álvarez Valencia is professor at the School of Language Sciences at the Universidad de Valle in Colombia and chair of the major in ELT, English Language Teaching Education, in the Interinstitutional Doctoral Program at the Universidad de Valle. In his research, he is interested in critical intercultural education and decolonial theory, multimodal education and multilingualism, among others. Some of his publications include a co-edited book titled Critical Views on Teaching and Learning English Around the Globe with Information Age in 2016, and the upcoming chapter, Practical and Theoretical Articulations Between Multimodal Pedagogy and an Intercultural Orientation to Second Foreign Language Education, and an upcoming article titled Roadblocks to Intercultural Mobility, Indigenous Students' Journeys in Colombian Universities. José's current projects include construction of a sociolinguistic and academic profile of indigenous students at Universidad de Valle. Second one, analysis of appropriation of the new education policy about teacher education in regards to the intercultural dimension. And finally, an exploratory study of pre-service and in-service teacher perception and experiences about the role of the nonverbal dimension in intercultural communication. It is such a pleasure to welcome you here today, and without further ado, I give you Dr. Aldemar Álvarez Valencia.
Wow, thank you, Manuela, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Anka and Isabel, for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here. And Nicole, thank you for that great presentation. I do think literature is a window to culture, and it's a great resource for us to enhance intercultural skills and also the colonial ways of looking at realities of students. I have to start by stating that by no means I consider myself an expert on the topic of decolonial thinking and social justice. My intention today is to share, and start weaving, as indigenous communities say here in Colombia, tejer, start weaving better understandings of how we experience engaging in decolonial work or thought. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. Now, I would like to first tell you a little bit my context. This is Colombia, a country situated in Latin America, and particularly I work in the city of Cali, one of the most multicultural cities in Colombia. And demographically speaking, as you can see on screen, the majority of the population in Colombia is made up by mestizos. Then we have NARP, as you see on screen, that's Black, Afro-Colombian, Raíz and Palenqueros. And then we have Romani, small population of Romani people. And we also have 115 indigenous pueblos, and that speak about 63 languages. Here's my university, located, as I said, in Cali, with about 30,000 students. And since you see there, since 2010, more than 1,000 students, indigenous students, have enrolled in any of the 200 programs, undergraduate programs of the university. This is a public university. So now I'd like to tell you a little bit about the story and how I engaged with, worked with indigenous students. So I am the chair of a major in ELT of the doctoral program that we have at the university. And one of the areas of research is in intercultural communication and interculturality in general. So back in 2018, I scheduled a course in the colonial theories and interculturality. And so I invited a colleague who, you know, he had been working on the topic of decolonial theories with his students. He was actually conducting research with indigenous students at his university, another public university situated in another city in Colombia. And so he taught the course and he gave a talk where he, you know, shared some of his work with the indigenous students. And the talk, I have to say that, you know, this talk was really enlightening. It was very inspiring and provocative. I realized that I had not um, I had not only been insensitive to and indifferent to indigenous students that we had in our program, in our language program, I had been indifferent to many things and very ignorant of the historical, socioeconomic, and cultural struggles of indigenous communities in Colombia. So, and then this talk did not only produce this effect on me, it also moved several of my colleagues. We were left wondering, you know, what we were doing and how we were serving fairly the indigenous students in our language classes and overall the university. So that's kind of like how the journey for us started. We began a dialogue with the Indigenous Student Council of the university, and we started designing a project, you know, to enhance Indigenous students' retention and graduation rates, since that's one of the major problems with Indigenous students in universities. The rate of the graduation rates are very low. And so this is what we did as we were working on the project. So we thought of a three-stage project with the main objective of um, designing and implementing programs and strategies to improve retention and graduation rates of indigenous students at Universidad del Valle. So we proposed a first stage in which we wanted to make a description of the sociolinguistic and academic profile of indigenous students. Then on a second stage, we wanted to identify the academic challenges and design a proposal to increase student retention and graduation rates. And also implement this proposal and evaluate those strategies, you know, the strategies for preservation, valuation, and integration of cultural semiotic resources of indigenous students in order to increase retention and graduation rates. Now, this is where we are now. We're actually completing the stage one of the, you know, this micro project, which is the description of sociolinguistic and academic profile of indigenous students. And it makes sense, you know, for us, it made sense to try to do that because we really needed to engage with the community and get to know them, and that they also engaged with us in a relation of co-construction. So we posed several questions. For example, this is the main question. What is the sociolinguistic and academic profile of indigenous undergraduate students at Universidad del Valle? And then we posed these other questions. You know, we wanted to know who they were or who they are, what is their family, social, and geographic background, what indigenous languages they speak, the relationships they have with Spanish, what foreign languages they speak, and what attitudes they have towards their own language, in the case they spoke an ancestral language and other languages. We also wanted to explore the academic characteristics of indigenous students of the university. And we wanted to find out about their performance in general and in particular in languages, and how they perceived their performance, given that the way we perceive performance, let's say Westerners, we perceive performance might not be the same way they perceive performance. And we wanted to establish any relationships between the sociolinguistic profile and their academic performance, or what kind of relationships could be established. So this is just to, like to let you know where we are in the process. We have worked with indigenous students to develop a sociolinguistic survey. We have, as you can see on screen, this is some of the researchers with some of the students of the Indigenous Council. And we have conducted ethnographic work, the sociolinguistic survey, and interviews, and one círculo de palabra, kind of like a talking circle, is one ancestral practice of indigenous communities where they gather together to talk about topics. So we have a lot of data. We are right now analyzing the data, and but that's not what I wanted to talk about today. What I wanted to talk about today was more, more from my experience, how I have, experienced and discovered many things in the intercultural encounter with indigenous students, and how I have felt about it. So I have put it like, there's so many things that I've thought of, but today, because of time, I've put it in terms of 3 feelings. The first one is feeling sentipensante. In Spanish. In English, that would be something like sensing, thinking, feeling the territory, and feeling decolonial. So here's this photograph shows one of the afternoons in which we were working with the indigenous students on the design of the survey. So I would like to touch upon this first idea, thinking of how I many times felt trapped in the cognitive or rational paradigm that I've been raised in, which favors reason and cognitive processes. And that's why I thought of calling this feeling sentipensante, or sensing, thinking subject. And I would like to draw on a quote from one of the indigenous students that has been working with us on the project. His name is Manuel. He studies political science, and he's preparing to become an ancestral medic in his community, the Misak Pueblo. He says when we asked him about what language means for him, this is what he says. He says, there are 3 dynamics to understand language. The first is called namrik. It comes from the mouth, from the voice, from person to person, and it has its grammar and everything else. And it allows understanding between us. And then there is namui one. Namui, our one voice. It means the voices of our territory, and it is the language that I can understand, such as the chirp of the little birds, let's say, shh, the voice of the wind, the voice of flames when they indicate something, and the voice of dreams. And there is another form of communication that is the Kamba one. Kamba, that means ancestral, one voice. the voice of our ancestral spirits that have showed us the world and nature. And this is why we find figures in the stones that our elder spirits left and allowed us to understand the world as we know it. You know, like when Manuel gave us this explanation of this, you know, this way, this meanings of how they see language. I thought of the ways that we have been raised to understand language in the West, that is very rational. You know, language is a monolithic and cognitive process that is basically located in our mind, and it's in our head, you know, and it's mobilized by our mouth. And this is why in language language teaching we have this idea of the language skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. All of them are presented as cognitive acts. Manuel's description lets us see that how language goes beyond that rational view and is felt, as he said, in the wind, in the flame of fire. And this idea does not only apply to language, it extends to all of the indigenous cosmogony. Is more sentipensante. And so this is why I use the term sentipensante, or sensing feeling, a term that was introduced by the Colombian sociologist Orlando Fals Borda, who heard it from a fisherman who said this, quotes, "We act with our heart, but we also use our head. And when we combine the two in this way, we are sentipensantes," kind of like feeling, sensing, thinking subjects. So this encounter with indigenous cosmogonies has helped me understand that there are other ways of knowing, you know, other ways of knowing that are not necessarily rational. In indigenous pedagogies, they talk about different sources of learning, and they think of dreams as a source of learning. They include spirits, their spirits, as the sources of learning. So that's a very different way of seeing not only reality but also sources and the epistemologies that we've been raised to believe that that's the way to that's the way for you to construct knowledge. Feeling the territory, and here I have a picture of the ceremony of inauguration ceremony of the Indigenous Council of the University in 2019, and this is when. Okay. I found this on the web for the ceremony of inauguration ceremony of the Indigenous Council. My cell phone, for some reason, series is activated. So. One of the things that struck me the most is when I think of the concept of territory that indigenous communities have, is that, you know, like I like the place I live, but I don't have that kind of connection with the spaces in which I live. Perhaps it's because I don't have a sense of belonging or ownership of a territory. But indigenous communities teach us about this connection all the time, and this is due to their connection to their territories and Mother Nature. In the West, we have created a binary between nature and humans, you know, something that does not exist in indigenous communities, where human beings, non-human beings, and non-living things have a territory that they share together, and they respect each other. Students are always threatened about losing the connection with their territories. For example, moving to university may lead indigenous students to undergo processes of deterritorialization and deculturation. Deterritorialization and deculturation consists of a type of cultural distancing and weakening of the ties between students' cosmogonies, languages, traditions, and their social and geographic territories. Interestingly, students' diasporic lives in the city and at university do not only follow paths of deterritorialization and deculturation, they also engage in processes of reterritorialization. They reterritorialize in production of new spaces of belonging within the new inhabited spaces and sites. This happens on university campuses, and for example, at my university, they have created the Indigenous Council back in 1990s, which is a university indigenous government that emulates, the administrative structure they have in their territories. They also have the inauguration ceremony of the officials of the council, which basically is exactly the same, is done exactly the same as it is done in their territories. And they were also able to obtain land on campus that they call La Chagra. Chagra, which is a space to cultivate, to grow on campus, and thus to keep in touch with their traditions and rituals. And they built this place called La Tulpa. They called it La Tulpa del Lago. And tulpa has different meanings, one of them being the place, but also the rituals that take place in it. And this is where they hold weekly cultural and political events. So what I see is that these activities, and I'm citing here a paper that I wrote with Manuela Wagner, these activities involve forms of recontextualization and material and symbolic rearrangements of the university sites and represent practices of reterritorialization because they allow indigenous students to keep the connection to the practices of their territories and visualize their cultural semiotic resources, including their languages, rituals, and traditions. Overall, this counter-hegemonic reconfiguration of spaces is decolonial. As you know, it enables symbolic restitution, self-affirmation, cultural sustainability, and the transgression of hegemonic and homogenizing politics of universities. And then you see here in this picture, one of the celebrations of Friday evening at the Tulpa. Feeling decolonial. So my experience, I just want to make sure you guys are still there because I'm not seeing okay, yes, I can see you guys still there. So my experience is that at the beginning of the project, I mostly felt, like there was something wrong. Indigenous students have a higher rate of college dropout and we needed to do something. And so, of course, because of the connection between indigenous communities and the theoretical frameworks of the decolonial perspective, it felt like it was the most proper perspective to adopt, and it seemed to me more like a perspective, that applied to the research, kind of like in the abstract. It was more like a rational take on it. However, little by little, as the research, as a research group, we started to feel that the decolonial perspective needed to apply to ourselves, because indigenous students in general, they understand their historical positioning and the colonial mechanisms that has targeted them and has targeted their languages and cosmogonies and territories. So it was very interesting to see how we were starting to feel that idea that the coloniality and the colonial thought needed to apply to ourselves. So little by little, I felt that my experience that was more theoretical, rational, became more grounded on sense and feeling. And this happened because of the chance that indigenous students gave us to spend time with them and engage in dialogue. And I then started to understand why, I mean, a little bit, because this is of course quite complex, why they feel and, 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 and why they feel and think in certain ways, you know, and why they do certain things. And I realized certainly how much they can teach us and how little we know about them, their cosmogonies, and ourselves. So this brings me to another point that I have reflected during my journey. Some people say that we have to indigenize ourselves, to go back to our roots and to find a lost identity. In Colombia, the great majority of people like me are mestizos, the product of the European mix with the indigenous peoples, or Afro descendants. So indigenous blood, just as like African blood, runs through our bloods. But I think this exploration of the indigenous self must be a personal journey. Perhaps the coloniality opens up the path for this exploration. That's what I think. But I agree with Walter Mignolo. Walter Mignolo says this in quotes: if you want to be decolonial, first you need to know your place in the colonial matrix of power, where you have been located and classified. Second, remember that the colonial matrix of power cannot be observed from outside, because there's no outside. We're all in it. Third, once you find yourself in the colonial matrix of power, your nationality, your religion, your language, your sexuality, your gender, your racialized ethnicity, you realize that you will have a number of options: disciplinary options, religious options, ideological options, political options, ethical options. Fourth, if you decide to embrace the decolonial option, you shall know that it is an option, that everything is an option, and then you begin to act, think decolonially. For decoloniality is both analytic doing and prospective doing, building and rebuilding the ways of life that modernity disavowed and destroyed. And fifth, do not assume that the decolonial option is the universal best. It would be the universal best for you, as the other options are best for the person who assumes it, which is, I guess, central in this, because we do not want to become dogmatic, even if we think this is good or bad, good at the best. We cannot fall into dogmatisms. So what I have felt during this journey is that we cannot feel the decolonial as indigenous communities, because more than us, they speak from the colonial wound, as the Chicano author Gloria Anzaldúa proposes. They feel it more than us because we have been in a space of privilege, and in many cases unaware of the forms of coloniality that oppress us. Perhaps we will never be able to experience this decoloniality as indigenous peoples do, but we need to try and know about it and understand it and recognize it. And I think one way of doing this is by embracing and welcoming the intercultural encounter with our indigenous communities, and with all diverse of the diversity that we find in our own communities. We need to gain this understanding from the corpo-biographical and corpo-experiential, as Frischknecht Borsani say. And this is a translation of mine from these authors. And they say, it is in this direction that the dimension of the colonial wound is not understood in all its magnitude. if it is not known from the corpo-biographical, from the corpo-experiential, from a body that feels and speaks it. In such a way, the colonial wound as a feeling and the frontier as a space constructed by those who are on the margins, on the edges, inhabiting the peripherality invented by colonial centrality, is felt more than known, or only known at the same time as it is felt. The colonial wound, therefore, is more of the order of the biographical, of the bioexperiential, than of the strictly theoretical and reflexive, although it's clear that the possibility of theorization is not disqualified, but something of the experiential must be experiential to know what we are talking about and what we refer to when we refer to this colonial wound. Thus, the colonial wound puts on stage suffering, feelings, and painful experiences, which arise from that which the modern colonial imperial paradigm tried to extirpate, as it also tried to erase the memory of such suffering. So, unfortunately, the colonial wound does not heal because the practices of discrimination, deterritorialization, assassination, and invisibilization of indigenous communities do not reach an end. And in many cases, we become complicit with what is happening. I do think that working with the minoritized communities is a way of recognizing that we don't want to be complicit in perpetuating these colonial practices. So to conclude, I have to be honest and admit that there are still many questions that I'm trying to respond and feel, as there are many answers that I'm still trying to understand and feel, because I think it's difficult to dissenter from the paradigms that you have grown to believe blindly. However, I consider that the possibility of intercultural encounters and the beginnings of intercultural dialogue um, have opened, in my case, the doors for the process of thinking and feeling the colonial. Thank you. Bye bye.